This is an all-ages service, so we graduate from sermon to story time. You know, those are the only parts of the sermons you remember anyway, so we're leaving out the fluff. As you know, there are 4 Gospels, and they each have their own way of telling the story of what happened on Easter Sunday morning. So the story I'm going to tell you is reliant mostly on John, and we allow Luke to fill in just a couple of details, but it's mostly John. It was the 3rd day. It was the 3rd day since Jesus had died on the cross, killed by the Romans. It had been a week that started really well, as we did last week, with people shouting and Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, and people were throwing down their cloaks and waving branches and singing Hosanna. They were doing what they always did to welcome new kings. They were welcoming, so they thought, a new era. And that new era had a good first half week. Jesus went into the temple, and he taught there, and he blew people's minds with his wisdom, and he answered tough questions, and all was well until everyone kind of retreated for the Passover. And they started to hear rumors that Jesus had been arrested. This amazing man who was growing and growing, more and more followers had been arrested, betrayed, it was said, by one of his disciples for just a little bit of money. And he was given a trial in the middle of the night that was short and unfair. And by the end of it, somehow, they had convinced the Roman authorities that this man, Jesus, was a threat to the Roman Empire. And so they had him killed on a cross, as the Romans were wont to do. That was a Friday. He died Friday afternoon. The problem was that Friday evening, when the sun sets, is the beginning of the Sabbath, and you can't do any work then. But there's work to be done when somebody dies. There's work to be done to prepare the body for burial. They didn't have the time, so they rushed the body down off the cross, and they rushed the body into a tomb, and they rolled a stone across to seal it for later. They would get back to it when they could. So Saturday was the Sabbath, and as you can imagine, all the followers of Jesus had a very, very bad Sabbath. Because what had seemed so hopeful a week before was literally all their hopes were killed, dead. What do we do now? As you can imagine, the mixture of grief and sorrow and anger and frustration and confusion. Not a good Sabbath. That was day 2. Day 3 was Sunday. And on Sunday morning, before the sun was even up, it was still dark, one woman couldn't take it anymore, couldn't stand the waiting anymore. So even before the sun rose, she was on her way to the tomb. That woman was named Mary, as were just about every other woman in Judaism at that time. So all these Marys had to have suffixes added to their names to keep track of which one was which. This one was Mary, who grew up in an area called Magdalene, so she was called Mary Magdalene. But she joined, of course, the ones we know about: Mary, mother of Jesus; Mary, mother of James; Mary, who was married to Clopas; and Mary, the sister of Martha. Can you imagine how confusing it might have been back then to say Merry Christmas? You didn't pay any extra for that one, so if you didn't like it. Mary Magdalene was on her way. I believe she was one of those people who, like many of us, think that the best way to deal with grief is to do things. So she wanted to do things. She wanted to get that body, and she wanted to treat it right. It was not treated right. If Jesus, her teacher, her rabbi, was going to have an awful death, which he did, he could at least have a decent burial. So there she was with spices ready to go. And she arrived at the tomb, still dark, but she could already see in this very, very dim light that something was wrong. The tomb was open. Stone had been rolled to the side, which meant that this body was vulnerable to anything. wild animals could get in there and do damage. This is bad. And in that dim light, she could see just enough inside the tomb to see that the body was gone, which meant she could have no closure at all. The body was gone. In her grief, she ran back to the disciples. We don't know how far that was, but she ran back to the disciples and told them, the body is gone. It's gone. The body's not there. The other disciples seemed to be paralyzed by their confusion, but Peter and John knew what to do. Have a running race. That's the way to deal with grief. Have a running race. So they ran to the tomb, but their hurry, their concern for Jesus turned into another concern, and that is to win the race. And John, who wrote this gospel, helpfully informs us that John himself, that he got there first. But he admits that he didn't have the courage to go in. Peter came in second, but had more courage and went in first. John followed. And then they saw what Mary Magdalene had said. The body is not there, but the linen was. And in fact, the linen that had been around his head was neatly folded and placed delicately on a rock shelf. John tells us at that moment that he and Peter believed. But what they believed, we don't know. Because what they did was, they just went back home. And we get the sense later that they really didn't understand any of it, because it wasn't until they heard later about other things that they could make any sense of it. They just believed and went home. Mary Magdalene had followed behind these boys in their running race. She didn't go home. She stood outside that empty tomb, weeping outside the tomb. And we're not told, but I wonder if she was thinking about her story with Jesus, because she does have a bit of a story with Jesus. Mary Magdalene was, despite the odd reputation we give her, a lot of us in churches we grew up with, we heard that she was a bad woman with a bad reputation. This is not the case. People got confused with another Mary. But anyway, Mary Magdalene was one of a handful of wealthy women who, with their own money, supported the ministry of Jesus and the disciples. She was a wealthy, independent woman, and it cost money to just wander around the hillside saying, "Blessed are the poor." And she supported them. She supported Jesus and the disciples. We also know this, that the male disciples, about the moment Jesus was being tortured and on his way to being put on the cross, that the male disciples all panicked and fled, while the women stayed. We are told that in multiple Gospels. The women stayed, and Mary Magdalene is always listed first among those women. Much like Peter and the disciples, it's Mary Magdalene and the women. She was a leader, and she stayed. We know she was there, according to John, right there when Jesus was crucified. She was there alongside 3 or 4 other Marys, and she heard Jesus from the cross say to Mary, his mother, make arrangements for her care after he died. Mary Magdalene was there when Jesus said, "It is finished," and that might have taken all the breath he had, because crucifixion is death by suffocation. And she might have heard that last exhalation, last sigh, seen the head drop, and watched the end of his life. She was there, we know, when the body was taken down off the cross and when it was put into the tomb in a hurry before the Sabbath. Mary Magdalene was there, and I'm wondering if she was standing outside the empty tomb, weeping, thinking about all of this, and wondering what it meant. And perhaps as a way of saying a final goodbye, she gave one last look inside that tomb. And then she saw something that Peter and John did not see. Maybe it wasn't there, or maybe they just couldn't see it. She saw an angel. And the angel asked her two strange questions. First, why are you weeping? We're not told if Mary Magdalene said anything. She probably didn't. But if I were Mary Magdalene, I'd be tempted to say, why do you think? And then Mary Magdalene said, whom are you looking for? Duh. But Mary Magdalene said nothing. Instead, still weeping, turned around to leave the tomb. And she left the tomb, and just outside the tomb, she ran into somebody that she assumed was the gardener. And then she had a thought. The gardener works here. Maybe the gardener was here over this past weekend and can tell me what happened. So she asked the gardener, there was a body laid here in this tomb. Do you know where it was? Did you see who took it? Where is this body? Do you have any idea? And the gardener looked at her with eyes full of love and gentleness and said, Mary. And she knew that voice. And then she looked and wondered how she couldn't have seen this before. It wasn't a gardener. Well, actually, it was the gardener. But that was Jesus. And if we read between the lines, which is dangerous to do, let me confess that, if we read between the lines, it seems that she ran to him and threw her arms around him and couldn't let go. And she just said, teacher, my rabbi. Because Jesus had to say at some point, you need to stop holding on to me, because there are still things that need to be done. And the first thing that needs to be done is you, Mary, need to go tell the others what you have seen and what you have heard. Now, those others were still just at home, hiding. They would eventually become known as the apostles, which is a word that simply means the ones who are sent. That's it. Apostles are just people who are sent. But before they could be sent out into the world to share the good news about God and Jesus and the resurrection, someone had to be sent to them because they weren't there. And it was Mary Magdalene who was sent to those who would be sent. And that is why she is still officially known in the church as Mary Magdalene, as the apostle to the apostles. In a sense, she's the first who was sent. And she went and told them, and they went and told others, who told others, who told others, who told us. We are here and have heard this because Mary Magdalene was sent. She turned and walked back. Mary Magdalene, who had stayed. Mary Magdalene, who had wept. Mary Magdalene, who saw eyes of love and heard Jesus call her name. Thanks be to God.